Welcome back to YourTown television program and my segment of it called Artivism, where we look for the intersections of art and our community, how each inform the other. And I'm really glad to have Paul Sinsar here, local author. Paul, thanks for being here.
I'm thrilled to be here and excited to be back on TV.
You bet. Let's do it.
It's been, I was 5 years old the last time I was on television, so.
Well, now, what were you doing at 5 years old?
It was my 5th birthday. My parents bought me a ticket to my favorite cartoon show over in Newark, New Jersey, and I was in the Peanut Gallery.
How about it?
So here we come.
Coming back at
60,
it.
That's exactly right, 60 years later.
I love it. So, now, Paul, you write under a nom de plume.
I do.
Ajax Minor.
Right.
And I find that fascinating because I've read some about you developing that. But why don't you tell us about that a
Sure.
little bit?
I mean, part of the reason is sort of my own personal history. As a kid, I think I've always had an active imagination, and as a kid, I pulled a book off the shelf in the library in elementary school, and it was the Golden Book of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it just captured my imagination. So after that, I was hooked on ancient history. I always loved that tale, and Paul Sinsar is an okay name, but I thought I'd like something a little bit different. The main character in my first novel, his name is Jack, J-A-Q,
Right.
And I always liked the name Jack. So I said, well, Jack, Ajax, there's an Ajax, there's a connection there. I didn't think, given my stature and probably my character's stature, main character's stature, who should be sort of like me, Ajax Major or Ajax the Greater would not exactly cut it. So I thought Ajax Minor made some sense. I thought it was a little bit kind of catchy,
Yes.
That's pretty much how I settled on that. But there's a connection between that classical allusion and also what happens in the book. The book is. It's not a classic. It's not high fantasy. The first book. It is not set in sort of the classic Tolkien medieval setting.
And yet you developed kind of the rules for this fantasy.
Oh, sure.
Very well in the book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You have to create a world, and there are classical characters that emerge in the book. There's Hector. There's Achilles. There's some surprises along the way, and then we also throw in some ancient Sumerian and Babylonian mythology as well, since my granddad was from Baghdad, and so having an interest in the Middle East and also, or not the Middle East, but ancient history, and gravitated toward that as well.
Well, you talk about your protagonist, let's say your lead character, being somewhat autobiographical in this.
Sure.
And you're a bond trader, I understand, and Jack's a bond trader.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct.
And so there's a lot I want to cover about your writing, but since we're talking about that right now, how is it for you as a writer? Because I was a money manager, and then I write novels.
Oh, okay, there we go. So
and I don't do that money management work anymore, but there was a time where I was doing both. What's it like for you, let's say, separating from one world or harmonizing with the other world?
Right.
What does that look like for you?
Not really an issue. I've always had a bit of a split brain. I can sit for hours and read what I love to read, things like philosophy, like Kant and Hume and all that. I still like to read Latin in the original. I can do that, and I love academics. Almost went on to get a PhD, but ended up wandering down to Wall Street. And I also was very at home, yelling and screaming in a trading room. So I just, I basically just am able to compartmentalize, which is something that I talk about in the book.
Yes.
It's something that my two characters do, Jack and Kate. They compartmentalize, and that's important when you go through. It can be important, let me put it that way, when you go through a catastrophe like we experienced personally.
Yes. Well, let's if you don't mind, let's talk
Sure.
about what kind of gave you the impetus to go down this road with
Sure. Yeah, I never really thought of myself as a fictional writer ever. I remember back in the old days, I took the writing sample, which they used to have. I guess they have to take it now. And the grades were 1 to 5, and I get back this grade on this fictional writing sample of 5. I said, that's ridiculous. I can't write anything but, academic prose. What are they talking about? And then my wife and I, the story begins and arises out of personal experience. We tried for 10 years to get pregnant, finally did. 10 years before Catherine, Katie's due date, we went in for a routine OB, and her heart tones were low, her heartbeat was low. Rushed over, had to have a crash C-section, and she was born, with all kinds of handicaps. Died 7 months later. So there's the personal, personal history and personal connection in there that kind of drives
this theme is in the book as well.
Yeah, the theme is in the book, and that's part of what drives it. I think it's interesting to talk about why writers, or we were talking about this before we went on the air, but artists in general pick a particular genre. It seems to be more the case with, I believe, with writers than with, let's say, a visual artist. Picasso went through his Cubist period, and went through his Rose period and his Blue period. It seems like writers, there's just an impression that writers tend to pick a genre and get comfortable, and they stick with it. It might be Jean Le Carré doing the spy novels, or Philip Pullman doing, who I think is the king of non-high fantasy, or whatever, magical realism. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and they sort of stay on that path. I'm not quite sure why that is with writing,
but you have gone down this path of kind of this metaphysical fantasy.
Right.
And so, talk about that a little bit, if you would, about how that works in the kind of dual realities of it. I'm reading Sun Valley Moon Mountains right now, and I'm feeling those dual realities.
Yeah, there are. Well, it's just it happens that fantasy is what comes out of my head, down through my arm, and into the fountain pen and onto the page. I mean, it's just
natural for you.
It's just natural. I've got another project in mind that's going to be maybe an alternative history, but it's still, it's still out there. It's on the edge. It's not real. And these are just the things that that just come out of my head. So it was easy for me. I love dreams. I keep a dream book, and sometimes you can you can pull some interesting ideas out of there. And so that's what was the genre that I found worked for me, and it worked in this too, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to show a couple that suffers a tragic loss.
Yes.
And it's the same loss that we had, and how they handle it. I wanted to give people an idea of a different way to handle grief.
Yes.
I remember we got a lot of very nice thoughts and cards from people, but when we get the cards with the with the bluebirds on them and the flowers, that wasn't my wife and me.
No, I hear you.
And so we have sort of a more stoic approach. So I wanted to give people a look at, how you handle grief, when you compartmentalize, when you can objectify it. But there's also, the nice thing about fantasy is you try to create an unbelievable world and make it believable.
Yes.
And the nice thing about fantasy is that you can have it emerge as anything you want, as long as it's a coherent story. And so we were able to bring my daughter back.
See, that's what I love. I mean, there's a closeness there, right?
Right.
That you can bring to these characters.
Sure.
To make the grieving process come alive, because I think that as I've grieved loss of loved ones, I have to connect with their spirit in a way that's real for me, in order to do that.
It's also, and what goes on in the book a little bit, between Jack and his wife Kate, even though they have similar views about the process. The interesting thing is they have to learn how to live with it, because when you are grieving, you find, as you find in the story with Jack and Kate, that they're not always on the same frequency. One might be high one day and the other might be terribly low.
Yes.
And Linda and I found this, and so it's reflected in the book that it's really important to be sensitive to the other person when you lose a child, and there's a mom and a dad. Be sensitive to where the other person is in the process,
yes. and how they do it. that even when
Well,
it's different from you?
it's how
right?
they do it. It's when they do it. It turned out that Linda, as I describe in the first chapter of the book, Jack wakes up and he hears this sobbing, and he goes into the master bathroom, and there's Kate crying, and he says, "What are you crying about?" She says, "What do you think?" And he says, she goes, "Or," and he says, "Or," and he said, "Yeah, that's right." My wife also went through a process after our daughter Katie was born, where she would do that every night.
Right.
I wasn't aware of it. I'd make sure I had, just like Jack, I'd have enough martinis so that I would go to sleep. But she would do that. And so when Katie died 7 months later, she was kind of pretty far down the road in terms of beginning to reconcile with it. In my case, I was devastated for a couple of days, and then all of a sudden I was just her dad. I had to take care of her. So mine didn't start till 9 months later. So you have to realize that you're really out of phase then.
Yes.
But it's really important that you're aware of that, and I try to make that point in the book.
Well, I think it comes through very clearly, and let's put the jacket up on the screen of Sun Valley
Sure.
Moon Mountains
Sure.
for everyone to see, because it does metaphorically state what this kind of dual
Yes.
reality, and it's
Yes.
lovely artwork as well.
Yeah, I have to give credit to Gene Harris out of Philadelphia for both of my covers. He's done a terrific job, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the book, so we had to really work pretty hard to capture as much as we could.
Simply.
Simply, exactly.
Yeah.
We've got the face of the child
Yes.
there. We have the spider,
Yes.
which is.
And the face of the child also has an ethereal quality to it.
It does, and it's a interesting, disturbing quality.
It is.
It's a disturbing
I'm
picture.
glad you just made that point, because the fantastical metaphysical part of this book, where you're connecting with Ur after she's gone,
Right.
but not gone.
That's right. That's
okay,
right.
At the same time,
Right.
is not only comforting, but it's also freaky. It's scary. Because you're entering that with your grief, right?
That's right.
Jack and
Right, and there are these odd things. That's why I call it fantastical realism, because
Okay.
there's the genre of magical realism where odd things happen.
Yes.
Just all of a sudden the wind will blow, and the Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Lovely.
He'd write about the leaves flying off the trees and they turn into butterflies.
Yes.
That kind of stuff.
Yes.
But these are a little more, these little scarier events that happen to separately and together to both Jack and Kate.
Yes.
And that they have to come to terms with in the real world of Ketchum, Idaho, Sun Valley, Idaho.
Yes.
And then the second half of the book, they take off into this other world, Luna, to try to rescue their daughter from an ancient being that, that had stolen her.
How cool is that? That's cool.
Well, it's nice, again, the nice thing about fantasy is I can do that.
You can do it.
I can't do that.
Yeah, I hear
here in Monterey. So with Katie.
So then there's also the girl from Ipanema.
Correct.
So this is a series, actually, right?
Oh yeah, no, there's a third book called Kutuzov's Dream.
Yes.
And for anybody who is not familiar with Kutuzov, he was the Russian general who commanded the Russian forces in the Battle of Borodino in 1812 and fought Napoleon to a draw.
And this is the project you're working on right now?
Yeah, it's done.
Okay.
The book's done, so I'm in the editing process
Okay.
right now. So I'll get that over to a copy editor hopefully within the next month or two and get the book out next year.
So kind of in broad brushstrokes, in the series, what is the arc of that from book to book? Girl from Ipanema, Sun Valley Mountains, and then into...
Right. It essentially is about, there's an evil force, big surprise, right?
Yeah.
Big surprise in a fantasy, there's a bad guy. There are two battles that take place in the first book. There's a penultimate battle between Jack and this being that stole his daughter, who happens to be the creatrix of everything. And then there's a final battle with this fellow Bildad Proud. And I won't.
Yeah. Don't give it away.
I won't give a spoiler.
But there's this reconciliation.
Let's put it this way:
Yeah.
he never goes away. So what we have to try to do is we have to try to find a way, over the course of 3 books, to identify him and then to see if we can defeat him. And Ur calls him the lie. And this is part of what the second two books are about. The first book is very much about and based on one of my loves, epistemology and philosophy, which is how we come to know things.
Yes.
Then we get into ethics in the second two books, and what is right and what is wrong. And this guy is called the lie, and basically what he is, he's the lies we tell ourselves to try to rationalize our behavior.
Wow.
When we do something, and
I hear you.
we've all done it. We've all done things
part
that,
of
if
what
you're
we
able to look
do.
at it objectively, you didn't really.
How do you tell yourself the truth?
How do you tell yourself the truth? And that's why he's called. That's why he's called the lie.
Yes.
And so the whole point is ultimately the second book is dystopian in the sense that there's a ecological catastrophe that occurs. And I've written about it, so there's no spoilers. The northern hemisphere kind of freezes solid. It's a little bit different from the global warming. And then there are a lot of political and social and economic consequences that fall out of it. And so we build toward the final book with this, again, another climactic battle with Bildad Proud, or Al No Side as he's called in that book as well.
He is looking forward to it. Yeah, that's great. Well, hopefully when you finish that project and get it ready to take out to the edited and ready to go, you would come back on and maybe read from it.
That'd be terrific. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, let's do it.
That would be great.
So let's talk about your creative, if you don't mind.
No, absolutely.
Let's talk about your creative process. And what's it like for you to sit down and write a book day to day? What does that look like for you?
I think it's a great question. I think most people have the idea. No, that may be inaccurate. A lot of people have the idea that of the sort of possessed artist. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and and all of a sudden I get this great idea, and I jump out of bed and throw on my slippers and sit down and start scribbling away furiously. I think there are writers that do that. There must be. At the other end is the maybe apocryphal story about Thomas Mann, who supposedly wrote 1 complete page a day. Done, finished, fully. I mean, I don't know how you do that.
But think about that. If you do it, you've written
a book in a year.
You've written a book.
Yeah, you're done.
Yeah.
Which is another point that I'd like to make. But but for me, there's a lot of discipline involved. I generally the creative process generally takes place on the weekends. Generally takes place early in the morning while my wife is asleep, and I focus on the book and the story at that point. And then editing, I can sort of do any time. And I'll have to say, some writers like one better than the other. I like editing and the creative process equally well. But what I'll do is I'll block time out.
Yes.
Each on the weekends generally, and it gives me a discipline to know that I'm going to be able to sort of complete this thing over time. And a lot of people will come up and say, "You're writing. How do you do that?" You know what? I mean, it's how do you write a book? I mean, I've always wanted to do that.
Yes.
And if people will go to my blog at ajaxminor.com, there is a blog about that, and I tell people, well, just do the arithmetic. Yeah. Go get one of those composition books, or you can use a Word document, composition books at Safeway or whatever. And if you were to write, sit down and write over the weekend 5 pages of that, double spaced, it's 100 words a page, it's 500 words. At the end of a year, you have 25,000 words written.
Yes.
That's a nice short story.
Yes.
If you spend 3 years, which I find is probably about the time it takes me to write a novel, you've got 75,000 words, and that's about right for for the first time out of the box.
Yes, it is.
So I definitely do that. I also I guess my process is a little bit different. You have people like Philip Pullman, who I referred to, that have these boards that are just littered with little Post-its, and they go back and they refer to them, and then some have very detailed outlines.
So Paul, I hate to do this, but I'm going to interrupt you because we're running out of time.
Okay.
But this is such a wonderful conversation about how do we create.
How do you write? Yeah.
Yeah, and then your next book coming up.
Sure.
Just let's do this again.
You got it.
Okay.
Sounds terrific.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being a part of this segment of Your Town, television program and Artivism. And stay with us. We've got another fabulous segment with author and visual artist Mark Baer. Thank you very much for being with us.